Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I moved to Oregon in 2005, and one of the first things I was told is that I had the good fortune to be within driving distance of the wonderful series that are put on by WorldOregon. And so I have been participating in the programming of WorldOregon for over 2 decades. Although I work at the University of Colorado, I still live in Oregon. And when Tim reached out to prepare the Great Decisions programming for this year, I was so excited to be included because it is the leadership that WorldOregon has provided in developing these kinds of series and informing the community about critical issues, both related to current events, but in a historical context, helps to make sure that our residents are deeply informed. So thank you so much for inviting me back, Tim. When I was asked to talk about this issue, the first thing that came to mind, this is not advancing my slide deck. Do you want to see if there's something that, oh, there we go. It's just slow. You know, the first thing that came to mind is, well, does it have a future? And I'm sure that that's, in fact, what prompted the title for today's topic. I hope that all of you had the opportunity to read the chapter by Alvarez. It was wonderful, very informative, and if you haven't read it, please go back and read it, because I am not repeating what's in that chapter. Instead, what I've tried to do is expand on that chapter and try and give you some historical context in the hope that it will give you a sense that there is a future for international law and human rights, but it might not closely resemble what we have seen since the end of World War II. And that's okay. And that's what I'm hoping you'll take away from this part of the presentation. So there are basically 2 parts to this lecture to help you frame intellectually and historically around the question posed by this week's topic. We're going to talk about modern international law first to put it in that historical context, and then we'll talk about modern human rights to also put it in the historical context. Modern international law is actually more recent in that around 400 years ago, we had a publication that really reframed the relationships between states. Now, some of you might wonder why I'm not starting with the law of the seas. And the fact is that the law of the seas predates modern international law, but because it really covers those liminal spaces, the seas, and now those principles have been carried over to space, it's far less relevant to our topic today. So rather than start with the law of the seas, which started just before modern international law, I'm going to start with modern international law in the context of the relationship between states. And basically, you know, the first framing of international law is that we have to assent to these relationships, and that these relationships should be governed not just by different religions and religious powers and moral frameworks, but that there is an inherent natural law that exists between people and exists between states that we need to recognize. And so this meant that suddenly it wasn't just about power or theology that would define the relationship between states, but that we needed to recognize that there was a certain order in the world that we needed to consistently follow in order to have predictability and more of a civilized world. You know, this writing by Hugo Grotius was followed shortly after that by the Peace of Westphalia, which is what most people recognize as the first treaties that gave rise to the modern international order. And this set of 2 treaties ended 2 incredibly lengthy wars that lasted literally for, you know, one of them for generations. And the idea was, well, how can we end wars that last a person's lifetime and their child's lifetime? And these treaties gave rise to several principles that continue today in the modern world order. The first one is that states are sovereign, and that it's important for us to recognize this inherent sovereignty of states. Another is that all states are equal. And so because you might be a very small state with just a very small population doesn't mean that you have any less legitimacy or any less sovereignty than a very large and powerful state. In addition to this, there became the recognition that states need to mind their own business. That if you don't like what's going on in another state, you need to focus on your own state and let their leadership deal with internal domestic issues. And the fourth principle is really critical, especially as it relates to human rights, which is that states need to respect the inherent religious freedom of other states. And this was coming to rise in the 1600s, of course, because of the rise of Protestantism. And this was all happening in Europe. So I'm not yet putting this in the context of other regions, but the modern international law framework was born in Europe. And it is what is regulating modern international human rights today. So within this, we have this framework, and then it really governed a lot of what happened over the next 2.5 centuries. And it was during this time that we had this Westphalia legal order. And in this period, people tried to, the different states, they tried to normalize diplomatic relationships. If we're all equal and we're going to respect one another's sovereignty, then we need to figure out how to standardize how we're going to interact with each other that doesn't require us to invade one another and try and control one another and decide what somebody else's or another country's religious belief should be. And in addition to that, it recognized that sometimes wars happen, that conflict is inherent to the human condition. And yes, there have been many attempts to try and reduce conflict, whether it's within individual relationships or within the relationships of states. But when we do have conflict, we should have rules about how that conflict is carried out. And I put a picture here of Henry Dunant. Henry Dunant, for those of you who don't know, is the person who gave rise to humanitarian law, which ironically is the law of war. You think about humanitarian law, you think we're talking about humanitarian aid. That's not, in fact, what we're talking about. We're talking about the law of war. And Henry Dunant was not, he was not a soldier, he was not a statesman. He was a businessman who was on a business trip and came across a field of dying soldiers and was horrified that there was no medical aid being provided to them. And so he founded the International Red Cross, today the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. And he was so horrified by the inhumanity of war that he said, okay, if you're going to fight, at least let's agree on what the rules are that will govern your fighting. And it included principles such as that injured combatants should be given access to medical aid, et cetera, and so on. And so we started to develop this law of war, which became the Geneva Conventions, and started to develop an international society that would help provide aid to people in war. And then in addition to that, because we were trying to stabilize the relationships between states, the states started to develop treaties. Sometimes they were bilateral treaties, sometimes they were regional treaties, but the idea was that everybody was looking for stability in society, and they said, okay, let's agree that we're going to do certain things for and with one another. And so we started to see this rise in international agreements, treaties. But these treaties, unlike what we've seen, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, were not universal treaties. They didn't apply to the entire world. They just applied to the individual states that agreed to it and the regional states that agreed to it. And then basically, people started to look back at, okay, well, what have been the customs of war in the past? What is normal? What's been the customs of international relations in the past? And let's start to recognize the power of custom. And today we refer to that as customary law, where this is the way that we've interacted with one another, whether, when at sea or whether on land, for hundreds of years. And so we're expected to continue to operate in that way because we want to make sure that life in the world order is predictable, that you know what to expect from another state, that you know what to expect from another ship. And then we had, in the late 19th and early 20th century, we started to move into a new era of international law. And what happened in this area, as you all know, there was rapid industrialization. There also was a significant expansion in colonization, where we had countries going around the world and occupying and trying to control other less powerful countries, often far from their home, and trying to extract minerals and labor and things like that from those countries. We saw that rise of the multilateral treaties under the leadership of Henry Dunant with regard to war, and then we had an attempt to try and write everything down to make it consistent in a shrinking world. However, we had, of course, World War I, and that led to the involvement of many people from many countries being killed, and an attempt to say, you know what, that was so horrible. The crimes that were committed, the inhumanity that was committed in that war was so atrocious that we're going to try and bring a world order together. We're going to invite countries to come together and form the League of Nations, and let's try and prevent another world war from ever happening again. Well, we know what happened with the League of Nations, that it was a failed institution, and of course, about a decade after its formation, we started to see the rise of despots in different countries around the world, including in Germany. And eventually the League of Nations failed, and we broke out into World War II. However, we did not lose hope as the civilization. We said, okay, take two. That did not work. So let's try and identify what went wrong with the League of Nations and make an effort to bring the entire world community together and prevent World War III from happening. Well, so far, we've been successful. Although there have been a lot of internal armed conflicts since the formation of the United Nations, there actually has been a significant decrease in state-to-state conflicts worldwide. So with the creation of this international body, the United Nations, we started to say, okay, what are the things that we're going to agree to in a global community? And remember that the world is continuing to shrink with modern technologies. Transportation had happened, advances in transportation had happened, such as the airplane and the automobile and things like that. We've got the rise of the telephone. And so suddenly we're a shrinking world, and we say, okay, let's get the whole world to agree, not just European or not just Western countries. Let's get the whole world to agree on what rules we're going to follow as a global community. And we said, okay, let's just agree that we're not going to fight anymore. Let's agree that we're not going to declare war against other countries except in very limited circumstances. Let's also agree that we all have inherent human rights that have been recognized by different communities, by different states, in different points of history, that we have all the same human rights that we're equally entitled to. And let's view that from an international perspective instead of just from an individual country's perspective or a regional perspective. And, oh, by the way, let's create some bodies that when there is a dispute, that they can hear the dispute and try and resolve it so that it doesn't escalate to war. Or when someone's rights have been violated, that they have some place to go and file a complaint. So let's create these international bodies, judicial and quasi-judicial bodies, to try and prevent conflict from getting to the point of violence. And then in addition to that, let's not limit international law anymore to the relationship between states. Let's include civil society. Let's include individuals. Let's include these, relationships that we're trying to foster through these organizations, so that way we can include everyone and basically everything within this new international order that was created post-World War II. And then in the last 35 years, we've seen an even more recent phase in international law where we've seen more fragmentation. And we've seen, for example, that we have treaties not just on human rights, but we have treaties on children's rights and women's rights and disabled persons' rights and on. And we have these different organizations all around the world that are hearing different complaints and making different rulings. And so suddenly it's not just the United Nations in Geneva or in New York that is where everybody comes together, but different complaints are happening all around the world, whether it's a trade dispute, whether it's a complaint of a company against a country, whatever it is, that we tried to create all these different systems around the world for those to be heard. In addition to that, we've tried to create bodies to hear problems facing international humanitarian, that law of war and criminal law. So this is a picture, of course, of the International Criminal Court at The Hague, where if someone commits genocide, for example, or crimes against humanity, they can be called before that court and criminally prosecuted for those crimes. Under the humanitarian law that we've set up internationally, that we have courts to hear trade and investment law disputes. We have treaties that try and address the environmental crises and climate challenges that we're facing. And so we've seen this almost balkanization around different topics that have proliferated from the UN regime. So that gives you a context of what international law has looked like over the last 400 years. Now I want to take you to a history of human rights, and so that you can recognize where and how they intersected, and hopefully that can give you some framing for what the future might look like given the challenges that we face today. So what is that, 4 centuries ago? 4 millennia ago? Almost 4 millennia ago, we had the Code of Hammurabi, which established law and accountability that was focused on justice. That it said, we have to follow certain rules in our society, and that means that you have to do one thing and you have to do another thing, or there are consequences. However, we recognize justice, but justice is not the same for all people. That there are inequalities in the human system of relationships that make some people more entitled to certain outcomes than others. So there was an inequality in this, but there was a focus on justice and a focus on law and order. In addition to that, we have what is often recognized as truly the first human rights document or human rights law, which is the Cyrus Cylinder. And this was what Cyrus published after conquering Babylon. And basically what he said is that we need to have freedom of religion, that we need to make sure that people are not forced to leave their homes, that we need to make sure that we have respect for other cultures, that we have respect for the different customs that people have, and that we need to liberate people who have been enslaved. And so when you look at the Cyrus Cylinder, you really see the elements of human rights that have continued to this day. And so these ideas that we have of human rights, they actually have been part of human civilization for well over 2,000 years. And then, of course, what we often think of, we often don't refer to the Sarah Cylinder. We all often focus more on the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta is that Western start to constitutional rights and constitutional law and civil rights that we think of in our Western history. And so we want to make sure to recognize that. And what's important about the Magna Carta is that it placed limitations on rulers that were not just morally based, that it was recognizing that sovereigns actually had to share power with their subjects. And it tried to introduce due process and legal protections for subjects. And it was similar to what we saw in some of our ancient documents, unfortunately based upon a belief in inequality of individuals. So that the Magna Carta, although it was considered to be revolutionary for its time, did not think that these rights applied to common people, that it only applied to nobility in relationship to the king. Of course, after that, there were many efforts in England, which included the liberation and ending of slavery. But even before that, we had the English Bill of Rights, where we started to see a recognition of individual civil liberties come to rise. And we saw an expansion of parliamentary power, so that the sovereign in England had to share power with the people, at least, the parliamentarians, in a way that placed a check on the power of the sovereign. And then, of course, we all know the story of Jefferson and Lafayette and the beginning of the United States and the French Revolution, and those were the next big advances in the development of modern human rights, where we had, of course, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen by Lafayette and Jefferson. And although we were working on the U.S. Bill of Rights at the same time, we didn't ratify it until 1791, so it falls a couple of years later on the timeline, but they were happening really concurrently with each other, and you see a lot of similarities between the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the U.S. Bill of Rights. And then I will be shut down today, I'm sure, because I always am, but I like to always talk about the Declaration of the Rights of the Child as being the next major civil rights or human rights document. I, as Tim mentioned, focus on children's rights, and children's rights particularly sometimes include family rights. But the Declaration of the Rights of the Child was really significant. It happened 101 years ago. And basically, Eglantine Jebb, who was a British school teacher, was in a war zone in Europe, and she saw children suffering, and they were suffering intentionally because of blockades from England and its allies. And England and its allies saw these children as the enemy because they were the children of the enemy, so they were trying to starve these children. And Eglantine Jebb and her sister said, no, children are their own people. They should not be starved because their parents, political leaders, are at war with another country's political leaders. We need to recognize the inherent rights of children. And she climbed to the top of Mount Saleve over Geneva, and she wrote the 10 principles that says children are entitled to the best that mankind has to give. And she took these 10 principles down to the League of Nations and said, we must adopt these principles. And the League of Nations adopted those principles unanimously. And so it really was this very powerful movement. Now, it wasn't binding. It wasn't a binding treaty. It was a declaration. And a declaration is something that you aspire to. But in my mind, it is really the first modern human rights document. And I'm told that it's not. And they say the reason is that it's only one population of human beings, children. And it's like, yeah, but we were all children once, like even those who don't survive to adulthood. So that's how I counter that criticism of saying, no, that should not be up there as a human rights, a significant human rights document. But in any event, what we all come to think about is what was written in our chapter and talked about a lot by Alvarez, which is that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN as an aspirational, its first major aspirational human rights document. And that declaration is not binding on states. We never expected it to be binding on states, but something that, you know, you then could enforce, but something that helps set standards of humane treatment for people worldwide. And that's what really took us into that United Nations period that we talked about you know, earlier. Now, what's interesting about that document is that it really bifurcated, especially in our retrospective analysis, different rights, and it played out very politically in this bifurcation on the world stage. On the one hand, you had the civil and political rights that you read about in the reading that the United States has been enthusiastic about. We had many of those rights in our Constitution, and we often say, hey, we don't need to sign that human rights treaty because we already protect people's rights better than most countries in the world. And so what we'll do is we'll share our knowledge of human rights to you, our constitutional rights, but we're not going to commit to them internationally. And we're certainly not going to commit to the economic, social, and cultural rights that also are aspired to in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which include a right to work, a right to Social Security, a right to education, a right to health, and a right to an adequate standard of living. You know, instead, we, of course, have gone more in the late 20th century down the neoliberal approach and said, we're going to let the markets take care of these things. If people want these benefits, then they're going to have to get it from their employers. And this bifurcation that was in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and not really intended to be a bifurcation there, but the way that it played out politically, this is what happened. There were two major treaties that you read about in the reading that addressed these different types of rights. So the first one is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the US has ratified. We signed it, it took a long time. We signed it by President Carter, and I think it was like 1977. He signed it, but then the way that we ratify treaties in the United States, it has to be signed by the president, and then the Senate has to approve it. And it wasn't until 1992, under the first President Bush, that it was ratified. And this recognized the right to freedom of speech and religion, due process and fair trial, political participation, and protection from torture and arbitrary detention. All things that are already built into our political system. Around the same time, the international community also developed the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which had those other rights, those what some people call entitlements, that the US refuses to recognize in international law. And so we've had this bifurcation, and it's created tension between the US and the international community because, as you read in the reading, a lot of people say that promising people these rights without giving them the means to have a healthy and vibrant life is meaningless. You can give people freedoms, but if they're not fed, if they're not educated, if they are not safe, then it doesn't matter. And so this is a challenge that's placed us at odds from the very beginning with the current global order. In the late 20th century into the early 21st century, we've seen this proliferation of human rights treaties that I mentioned earlier. That includes the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That is the most widely ratified treaty in the history of the world. It has been ratified, it's been signed by every country in the world. It's been ratified by every country in the world except for one. Does anybody know what country has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? The US. And we have contributed more language to that treaty, and we made more changes to the submissions from other countries who participated in the 10 years that we spent drafting that treaty than any other country who participated in the drafting. So our fingerprints are all over it. President Clinton signed it, And he did so at the urging of a dear friend who was the head of UNICEF, and he said, I am dying from cancer. My death wish is that you sign the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. President Clinton did, and it has been sitting in Senate ever since with no progress. And what they said, like this is a quote, that we will get to that right after we get to the convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. When do you think that's going to happen? Yeah, exactly. So no holding your breath, but there are things that we can do other than ratifying the treaty, and let's keep that in mind. And then, you know, the protection for people with disabilities and all sorts of treaties and different bodies have arisen in the late 20th century and the early 21st century. And then that brings us to today and recognizing, you know, what are the common elements in the modern human rights regime. One is that we view rights as being individually held, that a child has a right that is separate from their right in relation to their family or their relation to their community, that they are recognized as an individual and they hold those rights as individuals. And this is something that is inherent to modern human rights, is that we embed the rights in individuals, not in groups, not in roles that they have. We also say every human being, regardless of age, children have all the same rights that adults have, plus additional rights to protect them based on their status of children, except for things that they're, you know, not old enough to do, such as get married, blah, 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 blah. But in any event, we say, you know, these rights are universal, that it doesn't matter if you are an American or a Canadian. It doesn't matter if you are male or female. It doesn't matter if you are trans or straight, that everybody has human rights, and these are inherent in who we are as individuals, and we are allowed to enforce our rights against states. So if the US violates my rights as a human being, I can try and force the United States to recognize and respect my human rights. And then we also say that we are able to advance rights through treaties and through these bodies that have been created under the UN structure. In addition to that, it's important for us to recognize that we're facing a lot of challenges in the world of modern human rights. That one, it is so expensive. It is so expensive to make sure that everybody who is recognized to have a right to Social Security, everybody who has a right to education, everybody who has a right to health care, that those costs are paid for. And the whole system, the whole UN bureaucracy, is incredibly expensive to maintain. And so we've got to recognize that there is a cost to the modern regime. We also have to recognize that we've had a hard time actually enforcing human rights in any meaningful way. That we've tried, we've set up judicial bodies, we've set up quasi-judicial body, and yet we all know of human rights that are being violated on an almost daily basis somewhere in the world, and sometimes in our own lives. In addition to that, the current regime is set up where there are experts who are far away, and they may or may not be more expert than you are. I've been with children's rights experts who are part of the system that I swear I know things more than they do within the realm of children's rights. And that is hard to say. You've got somebody in Geneva who's making decisions, but they don't really understand the issues that are facing children in America, for example. And then you have these very large international bodies that might not have capacity to deal with the rights violations that you're encountering, and yet we're spending all this money to maintain these large bodies that bring together all of these countries from around the world and representatives who may or may not be able to make decisions, sometimes because of the rules that they themselves are governed by. And then there's the lack of cultural adaptability that you read about in Alvarez's readings, that some people say, hey, you know, women should not be equal in all societies. It depends on their culture and the custom, et cetera. Or that, you know, children should be subjected to the customs of our culture and shouldn't be brought up according to Western values. And so these become very challenging to the survivability of the system. Before I close and we start taking questions, I just want to recognize that although we've been focusing very much on Western sources, primarily, for these rights and for the system, the fact is that human rights and the values that govern today's modern world have influences and synergies with different teachings from around the world. So that, for example, if you look at Hindu and Buddhist traditions, they talk about the importance of protecting life and avoiding unnecessary suffering. They talk about the importance of exercising restraint, showing compassion, the importance of not engaging in violence. When you look at Confucianism, you see the importance of having political leaders act humane and govern in humane ways that recognize the inherent humanity in all of us. When you look at the edicts of Ashoka in India, you see teachings about the importance of tolerating different religions from our own to make sure that rulers think about the welfare of their subjects, the importance again of that humane treatment. And then of course in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, we talk about the inherent dignity of each of us, that each of us was made in the image of God, which means that, you know, we are all equal to God. And so it's important for us to recognize that these are universal values that we've seen across cultures and across time. So I hope that was helpful in giving you a broader sense of the fact that today's reality is the result of thousands of years of efforts working towards a more humane world. It's been successful in a lot of ways, and we have had a reduction in the number of international wars since the rise of the modern framework, but we've got a lot of challenges, and we're right to be thinking about what the future might look like. But keep in mind that the only thing constant is change, and you adapt or you die. So let's be open-minded and figure out how we're going to adapt to a changing world. So, Tim?
Wow, thank you. So I've got a microphone, Derek has a microphone. Because I'm holding a microphone, I'm going to ask the first question, but be please thinking about your questions, make them germane to the topic, and we look forward to seeing what you come up with. I'm curious, you sort of touch on this a little bit, but universality, there are a lot of critiques of universality, that it doesn't address cultural diversity. The other challenge is American exceptionalism. And when we're looking at stepping away from larger international agreements, multilateral associations, and in essence breaking the norms, what is the conversation in your world? What are international law scholars talking about in terms of how do we move forward if universality doesn't work, exceptionalism is preventing us from being part of this? Is it too broken to move forward, or is this a blip in the road?
I don't want to repeat the conversations that people in my world are having, and my circles are having, because there is a tremendous amount of distress. You know, I am in my 50s, and I grew up in a time when the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was being introduced, and, you know, was to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and I saw great hope. And I went to the war in the former Yugoslavia and saw some horrific things done to children there. You know, gang rapes of 5-year-olds and things like that. And it was like, this can never happen again. We need to, thank God we have the United Nations, thank God we have this treaty, thank God that everybody is ratifying it. We're going to create a better world for children. And that, of course, was in my 20s. And now here we are 30 years later, and we have 24/7 news, and there are horrific things being done to children all around the world. And we're seeing it, you know, perpetuated by technology. And so I don't know anyone in my world, you know, in my circle of professionals and experts in international law and human rights who knows what's going to happen. You know, there are moments when people are very dejected and very hopeless. And there are moments where we recognize that it will change, that probably things will become more regional, that is probably too much to have the entire world operating on the same system with the same values. At the same time, when you look at technology, like, we are in the same world and we are experiencing the same thing. And, you know, kids worldwide are on phones, whether they're in Africa, whether they are in China, whether they are in the United States, that they are on phones, that we're saying 1 in 5 kids experience sexual exploitation, you know, in digital spaces, you know, and so if we are having universal experiences in an even more shrinking world, shouldn't we have universal expectations and standards for what the human experience will be? And so you have hope in that now when I see Australia introducing certain laws, or I see the EU introducing certain law, or the EC, I'm like, okay, this is great, because maybe this will spill over into the US, because we are a much smaller global society than we were even 100 years ago. So the bottom line is that I think that we don't know any better than you what the future will hold, but it's scary because it is change, and change is inherently scary.
This is a question from somebody who's practiced this on the ground for 30 years in conflict zones. You've painted a optimistic picture. When we went through this, I'm 70, in my 70s, so at the very beginning of this, the realization that even during the golden age, those intrastate wars where 20 million people were killed, estimated. So there wasn't peace, okay? But going and ask the question, what do you do now when you have the infinite elasticity of preventative war, when you wage unhumanitarian war with free fire zones and massive collateral damage, when you have institutions universally, and the human rights institutions have declared a genocide and nothing is done about it? And I mean, we can go through several of the, and we have a country that is doing what any human rights or humanitarian law person would say, extrajudicial murder on the seas. You know, how do you address those questions in order to impact the United States to the point that we're even now threatening invasion of a sovereign country?
Multiple sovereign countries.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've already invaded one with Venezuela. These are all massive, clear, under the law, violations of humanitarian, international, and human rights law.
Well, and that really raises the issue. Feel free to clap if you want. I'm not trying to, you know, yeah, no. No, and I think we all want an answer. And I am totally transparent. I'm glad you saw that I painted a very optimistic picture, because, you know, as I shared during my opening, you know, the first thing I thought when I read the title and Tim said, would you present on this? And I'm like, what future? You know, because I have days like that. And then what I find helps me is to step back and look at human history and where this has come from and how much progress we've made across time. And I think often about something that President Obama said in it was either late 2016 or early 2017, and he said, the arc of progress is not a straight line. It is jagged, it is a jagged arc. And that when great progress is made, there will be great pushback. And that our challenge for those of us who want civilization, who want humanity to continue to progress, is to not become dejected and disengaged when that pushback occurs, but rather to try and limit how far it pushes back and to keep trying to make the progress go forward. And so when I start to get discouraged by current events, I'm like, okay, I've got to do what I can to continue to fight for children's rights so that we don't go too far down or too far backwards and continue to make progress. So that's a frame of reference for me. I think I did recognize, and I might not have articulated it, it was on the slide, but I don't think I articulated it, was that one of the greatest challenges with modern international law and human rights is what you've described through example, which is a lack of effective enforcement. And so part of this is, treaties are nothing more than promises. And we say, like in a marriage, that I say to my husband, I will be faithful to you. And he says, I'll be faithful to you too. But I can't make him be faithful to me. If he is determined to violate our vows, that's something that I can't prevent from happening. It's like promises happen between individual people, they happen in communities, they happen in, countries, and they happen internationally. But because we make promises doesn't mean that we can force people to keep them, that we can force other states or other individuals to keep them. And that's part of what we're witnessing today, is that historically, power has always been a threat to peace. And when you have people who say, I will not be bound by international law, I will be bound by my own morality, and exercise not just my individual power, but the power that my position gives me, how do you stop that? And that's part of what gives rise to war. And then the question is, for the people who say you can't do that, you can't invade a sovereign nation, how are they going to stop it? Are they going to declare war against the most powerful military in the country with the most powerful military in the world? And is that what we want them to do? I mean, these are really, really challenging questions that cause me to step back, take a deep breath, and say, okay, we have had human rights for thousands of years now, and we've called them different things over time. We will continue to have goodness in the world if you are a good person, if I am a good person, if we teach our children to be a good person. And, and that's what we do have control over, is speaking out and exercising goodness in our relationships and advocating for goodness in larger society.
Yes, actually, I think you've already answered this. My question was to be, when they were imagining and creating these, or setting up, like the International Criminal Court, did they not have any plans for enforcement? I mean, but you were just answering this already, I think.
No, that's a really good question. I actually haven't answered that. So the challenge with the International Criminal Court is that it was born, like all of these, modern human rights, that it was born from a treaty. Basically, you all know about the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, that after World War II, we set up these tribunals to try and hold people accountable for inhumane actions that they took in the context of war. And that more recently, we've set up additional tribunals in the late 20th century in Cambodia, for example, and Rwanda. And what we started to understand in Yugoslavia, and what we started to understand is, well, we probably should set up a permanent tribunal, one place in the world, so that we don't spend all this money setting up and then taking down tribunals regionally all around the world. And so we set up this permanent court, and it was based upon the Rome Statute, which is a treaty that says we all recognize the jurisdiction of this court, and we agree to cooperate with the court and to be bound by its rulings, but it was voluntary. So do you think that the U.S. signed the Rome Statute? Do you think Russia signed the Rome Statute? It's like, this is the problem, is that the most powerful countries in the world aren't going to sign some of the treaties that would limit their power. And we know that one of the main ways to prevent abuse of power is not to give any one person or entity or, politician, or country too much power. And that was what our founders recognized in setting up the United States of America, is we need 3 branches of government so that they can be a check on the power of the other branches, because they saw the abuse of power in England and wanted to set up a system where no one person or even one branch would have too much power. But that doesn't prevent countries that have too much power from saying, well, I'm just not going to be a part of a system that limits my power. So that's the problem that we have with the International Criminal Court. It was often the less powerful countries that joined that treaty. And so what war criminals did they go after? They went after the ones in Africa, which was totally legitimate because you had people in Africa who were kidnapping children and forcing them as sex slaves and forcing them to be child soldiers. So I completely support those prosecutions. At the same time, 20 years in, people are like, wow, you've disproportionately prosecuted a lot of African war criminals. And in the meanwhile, you have war crimes being committed on our television or on our phones every single day, and no one's going after them. And it's like, well, sorry, we don't have jurisdiction over, the countries where those crimes are being committed. And so that's the problem with the International Criminal Court, is that we relied on everyone to voluntarily subject their countries to the jurisdiction of that court, and not everybody has. And now we have disparate impact from the prosecutions that have been carried out.
Hi, I have a question. I appreciated how you brought up sometimes we know more than the people who are in positions and authorities. And my question is, do you think for those who are in Geneva or Washington, D.C., do you think they're aware of that? My question comes in because I remember I went to college in Buffalo, New York, mostly Caucasians, and my teacher was talking about business in Asia, but it was off and off. I didn't call him out or anything like that, but it left me with a lot of questions. Then because of my work, I go to different countries for consultations. I'm supposed to know more than they do because that's how I'm getting paid. But every time when I go to different countries, especially in Africa, South America, I realize how little I know. And it makes me feel uncomfortable to admit it. So I feel it. So if they are in a bigger positions in a DC, Geneva, do you think they're aware of it? And is there anything they're doing to minimize that?
Yes and no, and yes. So I think some people are aware, and let me be clear that I know a lot of people in Geneva who know a lot more than I do about a variety of topics, including children's rights. But I have had experiences where I've interacted with people in power in Geneva, including in my field, that don't know, particularly about certain issues that I know very deeply in the area of children's rights, and that they're just touching base because they're a general expert and were appointed for political reasons or whatever. But I do want to say there are a lot of people in Geneva who absolutely should be there and know their fields better than I do, including in my field. That being said, I think that generally those people who are really competent are aware of limitations of their competence. And oftentimes it's the people who are not very competent who don't realize that they actually don't know their material very well. And so I think that there are both in Geneva, those who are aware of the limitations of their expertise and those who don't. At the same time, there has been an effort, thanks to modern technology, to include more people from around the world in these proceedings by, for example, allowing them in the last few years to participate remotely in these proceedings. And so it used to be that in order for someone to consult with the International Criminal Court, they had to actually go to The Hague. Well, now they have secure communication channels where they can talk to victims on the ground in a country in Africa, for example, who can provide them with testimony as part of their investigation when they're trying to decide whether or not to prosecute a suspected war criminal. And then if in fact they decide to prosecute that person, they can bring the witnesses to The Hague to testify in court. But at least for those initial investigations in the ICC context, or if you're talking about a UN body, as you know from your readings, that when countries sign these treaties, a lot of them are reporting treaties, and so they go before the UN bodies and they say, here are all the things that we're doing to comply with our obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Well, what they do now is they allow anybody who has experience in this field, it can be personal expertise based upon your experience as a child and having your rights violated as a child. They allow you to sign up to come and testify before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And so we now have technology that allows them to reach out, and they're actually making much more effort to make it easy for people affected by these treaties, who should be protected from these treaties, to share their experiences than ever before. So technology has really helped in that way, and there's a concerted effort to reach out to communities, to reach out to individuals, to reach out to victims, children, people with lived experience in the field. So there is a movement in that direction, and it is being facilitated by technology.
Great. We are pretty much at time. I just want to ask you one quick thing, which is oftentimes when we do these issues, it is really hard to present an issue and not walk out feeling small and helpless. So how do you keep maintaining hope? And what are things that everyone in this room can do when we walk out of here today to reinforce the need for thinking about these issues?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, this might not work for everybody, but I got a puppy. And I have not had a puppy since I was a kid. And I will tell you that my husband, who is very distressed often, our teenage daughter, our college-age daughter, every time they walk in the door and they see our puppy wagging its tail and eager to play with them, it takes them down a couple of levels. And so, like, figure out like what you can create in your life, whether it's friendship, whether it's a pet, whether it's family relationships, whether it's coming to, community talks like this. Like, figure out what will feed your soul, and then intentionally create a life where your soul is fed. There are things that you have control over, and there are things that you don't. And you've got to figure out how to separate the two. And those things that you do have control over, grow those flowers, grow those friendships, take care of those people, those pets, whatever it is, but spread goodness in the world. And if you have power by voting, vote. If you have power by reaching out to your elected representatives, reach out to them, tell them what you think, but figure out like where you have control, and then make that as positive a place as you can. And have faith that these battles between good and evil have been happening throughout human existence. And for thousands of years, you have people who have taken a stand and said, this is what we should do. We should treat people humanely. We should treat people with kindness. We should respect the differences among us. And that is our inheritance from human history. And we want to pass that on to our own children. And so recognize the power that we have to do what we can to keep that goodness vibrantly fighting evil in our world. And that's the advice that I would give.
Amen. Thank you for that. That is why we do the programs we do at World Oregon. We've been doing them for 75 years because we can't look away, and we need to find that balance. So you framed that just perfectly. Thank you so very much. Thank you, all of you, for your questions. Please join us next week when we look at Ukraine and the future of European security. It's not a puppy, but it is worth talking about. So I want to remind you, we have these wonderful briefing books, which are available, $35 for you from Good Family Today. And we will have them throughout the series. It is helpful to read the material when you come in here, because you can come up with some really great questions and even challenge our speakers. Fight them in civil discourse. So thanks a lot, and we will see you next week.